There are four parenting types. They're listed under three broad categories of permissive, authoritarian, and authoritative. But permissive actually has two: permissive neglectful and permissive indulgent. These types are denoted by the control and the warmth. So do we have high control and low warmth? Do we have low control and high warmth, and so forth? First, under permissive, we have permissive neglectful. In permissive neglectful, the parent sets few limits or control, so there's little warmth. There's also little responsiveness. They're not all that involved in the child's life. In permissive indulgent, the parent has few limits or control, but they are involved in the child's life. For instance, they may go to soccer games or whatever. The third style is authoritarian. Authoritarian, the parent is highly controlling. There's a lot of limits, but they're not involved in the child's life so much, not showing a lot of warmth or responsiveness. And then finally, we have authoritative. In authoritative, the parent sets and enforces limits, so there's high control, but they're also very involved in the child's life, so there's high responsiveness. To remember these two types, we can remember authoritarian has two R's, so that's rigid ruler, and authoritative has two T's, and so that's tender teacher. What happens under each of these styles in permissive neglectful, where there is low control and low warmth, the children tend to have poor social skills and little self-control. They tend to be overly demanding and disobedient. In permissive indulgent, parents set few limits or demands, but are highly involved and emotionally connected. Children often fail to learn respect for others and tend to be impulsive, immature, and out of control. In authoritarian, our rigid ruler, where there is high control and low warmth, the parents set limits, have lots of rules, but they're not involved in the child's life. The children tend to be easily upset, moody, aggressive, and often fail to learn good communication skills. That doesn't mean they don't learn to communicate. Of course they learn to communicate. They just don't have good communication skills, telling other people their needs and what they want. Finally is authoritative, where the parent generally has limits and they enforce those limits, but they're also very involved in the child's life and they're emotionally supportive. And because of this, children have learned to be responsible. And so those children become self-reliant, self-controlled, high-achieving, emotionally well-adjusted, and so forth. Our next area of development is moral development. We had a class at one point where I asked you if you could throw a switch on a bridge and a train was diverted to a track, would you throw the switch so that either one person was killed instead of 5 people? In Kohlberg's design, he set up situations where he would ask people these moral questions. For instance, if there's a special kind of drug that could cure a certain kind of cancer, and druggists made that drug and sold it for 10 times what it cost them to make. And a man had a wife who was sick and he could only afford to pay about half of that cost, but the druggist told him that the wife is dying, or the druggist said, no, he discovered the drug and I'm going to make money for it. So the man broke into the druggist store to steal the drug for his wife. Was that man right to steal the drug? What Kohlberg looked at was not what was a right or wrong answer. What he presented with these moral stories was some dilemma, and he looked at the people's reasoning and how they justified whether the man was right or wrong. Okay, so they looked at the reasons that they gave. And with that, he came up with several stages of moral development. In the pre-conventional stage, which goes from birth to adolescence, moral judgment is self-centered. What is right is what you can get away with. So moral understanding is based on rewards and punishments and exchanges of favors. In the pre-conventional level, the first stage is punishment obedience stage. Children focus on their self-interest. Okay, they look to obedience to authority and the avoidance of punishment. They ignore people's intentions. And so a 5-year-old might say that accidentally breaking 15 cups is badder and deserves more punishment than intentionally breaking 1 cup. In stage 2 is the instrumental exchange orientation. Children become aware of others' perspective, but their morality is based on reciprocity, an equal exchange of favors. I'll share my lunch with you because if I ever forget mine, you'll share yours with me. The next level is the conventional level. The individual accepts conventional societal norms because they help ensure social order. Morality is judged in terms of compliance with these rules and values. Under the conventional level, stage 3 is the good child orientation. Their primary moral concern is with being nice and gaining approval. People are judged by their intentions and motives. In stage 4, individual takes into account societal laws. Individuals understand that if everyone violated the laws, even with good intentions, there'd be chaos. According to Kohlberg, stage 4 is the highest level attained by most adolescents and adults. The next level and last level is the post-conventional level. In the post-conventional level, individuals develop a personal standard for right and wrong. They begin to see abstract principles. So they define morality in terms of abstract principles and values. Under this level, stage 5 is the social contract orientation. When laws are consistent with the interest of the majority, they're obeyed because of the social contract. Laws can be morally disobeyed if they fail to express the will of the majority or fail to maximize social welfare. And finally, in stage 6 is the universal ethics orientation. Right is determined by universal ethical principles that all religions or moral authorities might view as compelling or fair, such as nonviolence, human dignity, freedom and equality, whether or not they conform to existing laws. So Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela all intentionally broke laws that violated universal principles such as human dignity. So we have 3 levels of morality: the pre-conventional level, the conventional level, and the post-conventional level. And each level has 2 stages, giving us all 6 stages. When we look at the major areas of criticism, we look at moral reasoning versus behavior. There are studies that have shown that there's a positive correlation between higher stages of reasoning and higher levels of moral behavior. Other studies have found that situations are better predictors of moral behavior. Research participants in this study were more likely to steal if the money comes from a large company rather than from individuals. So people may steal in one instance but not another. It depends on the situation. Kohlberg's theories tend to emphasize values that are more often held by men, such as rationality and independence, while de-emphasizing common female values, such as concern for others and belonging. And lastly, there's cultural differences. The first 2 levels match very well cross-culturally, but there are some differences among cultures. Europeans and Americans tend to consider whether they like or identify with the victim in questions of morality. Hindu Indians consider social responsibility and personal concerns to be separate issues, reflecting the Indians' broader sense of social responsibility. And so we can see in this cartoon, I swear I wasn't looking at smut, I was just stealing music, that people have different levels of what they think is moral. So looking at pornography might be immoral to him, but he's saying he can steal music because that's just something everybody does. Okay, here's a little question for you. Anna is self-reliant, self-controlled, high-achieving, emotionally well-adjusted. What parenting styles did her parents most likely follow? You said authoritative. You were correct. George would like to wear 2 earrings and a black leather studded jacket, but he's worried about others' disapproval. He's most likely at what level of moral development? If you said the conventional level, then you are correct. Erikson had 8 psychosocial stages of development. I generally don't ask questions about this on a test, so it's not something you really have to know in the long term, so I'm going to zip through it pretty quickly. Our 8 psychosocial stages are trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame, and doubt, initiative versus guilt, and industry versus inferiority. Identity versus role confusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, and ego integrity versus despair. So when children are little, they learn to either trust or mistrust their caregivers based on what kind of needs they got, such as food, affection, safety. So they learn to trust others or mistrust. As they grow, the toddlers start to assert their sense of independence, which is autonomy. If they're encouraged in this kind of self-sufficiency, then they learn to be independent. Otherwise, they develop doubt and sometimes feelings of shame. Preschoolers learn to initiate activities, and they develop self-confidence and a sense of social responsibility. Otherwise, they develop anxiousness and feelings of guilt. From ages 6 to 12, children who succeed at learning new productive life skills develop that sense of pride and competence. That's called industry. If they fail to develop those skills, then they feel inadequate and unproductive. They develop inferiority. In the adolescent years, they develop a stable self-definition of who they are, their identity, and they explore roles on deciding who or what they want to be in terms of their career, their attitudes, and so forth. So this can resolve their identity crisis, or it could lead to apathy, withdrawal, or role confusion. In young adulthood, they learn to form lasting, meaningful relationships, which help them feel a sense of connectedness and intimacy with others. If they don't, they become psychologically isolated. In middle adulthood, the adults look to be nurturant of the younger generation. If they don't meet that challenge, then that leads to self-indulgence and a sense of stagnation, being stuck there. And lastly, as an older adult, they look back on their life, and if that reveals that they have a life well spent, then they experience self-acceptance and satisfaction, which is ego integrity. If not, they may experience regret and deep satisfaction, which is despair. So again, you're not going to have to worry about the 8 stages of Erikson's psychosocial development, but there they are. And if we were in class, we might have a discussion on reflecting on if you feel you've successfully resolved the stages that you've gone through up to this point. Another part of development is our sex and gender identity. Sex is going to refer to our biological maleness or femaleness, including our chromosomal sex. Gender is a psychological and sociocultural meanings that are added to that biological maleness and femaleness. There are differences in sex. Okay, the average man is 35 pounds heavier and 5 inches taller and has less body fat than the average woman. Men tend to have broader shoulders, slimmer hips, and slightly longer legs in proportion to their height. There's functional differences. The hypothalamus causes men to have constant levels of sex hormones, whereas women have cyclic sex hormone production, goes in cycles. The corpus callosum in the brain, that bridge that connects the two hemispheres, is larger in women. So some say that they can integrate into information from the two halves of their brains more easily. The cerebral hemispheres might explain differences in verbal and spatial skills. Men produce testosterone throughout their entire lifespan, whereas estrogen production in women virtually stops at menopause, which then puts women at a greater risk for brittle bones. Women are more prone to knee damage because their wider hips put strain on the ligaments. When we look at cognitive abilities, women tend to score slightly higher on verbal skills and men score slightly higher on math and visual spatial skills. Those differences aren't as great today as they were years ago. When we look at toys that young children have, okay, girls play with dolls and they develop these relationship scenarios. There's a lot of talking back and forth. Boys play with cars and blocks and things that have these shapes, and so they develop these visuospatial skills. As far as aggression goes, men tend to exhibit a greater physical aggression. Women tend to exhibit greater relational aggression, such as spreading rumors or excluding someone. So how are gender roles developed? Well, there's different theories. One is that there's societal expectations for what's normal and appropriate male and female behavior. Those are the gender roles we give. The social learning theory of gender role development suggests that these gender roles develop as children, that they receive rewards and punishments for gender role behaviors and attitudes. Okay, when the little girl comes walking out in the princess dress, oh, you're so cute. If a little boy comes walking out in the princess dress, it's like, what are you doing in a dress? Boys don't wear a dress. So what kind of rewards and punishments do they get for the behaviors they exhibit? They also look at others and they tend to observe their mothers, fathers, okay, other adults, and they imitate those behaviors and attitudes. The cognitive development theory combines the social learning theory and cognitive processing. Children tend to form gender schemas. Remember those mental blueprints of what's correct behavior for boys and girls. And as children play, sometimes other children say, well, this is what boys do, this is what girls do. So that may have an effect on gender development. Androgyny is combining the characteristics that are typically male, like assertiveness and athleticism, with those that are considered typically female, being yielding, nurturing. And so we have both andro and gyn, male and female, androgyny. And so there are some that may exhibit androgynous looks, hard to tell kind of if they're male or female. They may act in androgynous ways. So what is it that combines, or what is it that differentiates sex and gender? Okay, sex is the biologicalness and gender is the roles that we assign. And then what is it that is typically male and female? That's androgyny. If we were in class, we'd have this discussion, what are the best and worst things about masculine gender role, female gender role. At some point, we may have some kind of board where we can post your thoughts on that. And I might ask you to write a little something that would explain if you think everyone would be better off if we were all androgynous. Why or why not? So think about that. I might have you write something down. Cultures have an effect on our development. There are individualistic cultures that individualize or that emphasize the individual's personal needs and goals over those of the group. And then there's collectivistic cultures, which emphasize the needs of the group over the individual. In an individualistic culture, I have myself and others are outside of that. In a collectivistic culture, my sense of self is based on the others that I'm part of in a group, whether it's family or friends or coworkers. And so if I do something wrong, that brings shame on everybody. Typically, in an individualistic culture, when things go wrong, the first question is, who's to blame? In a collectivistic culture, when something goes wrong, the question is, what can we do about it? So if you thought about it, which culture would you want to be part of, or which do you think is better? An individualistic culture or a collectivistic culture? Again, I might have you write some thoughts down about which one you find more appealing, which one you think is more valuable, and why. Developmental challenges through adulthood. One is developing a loving and committed relationship. The other is finding rewarding work and a satisfying retirement. And lastly, coping with death and dying. One impact on development is divorce. Half of the U.S. marriages end in divorce. That has very serious implications for both the adult and the child. Both the spouses experience emotional and practical difficulties, and so they're at a higher risk for depression and physical health problems. Realistic expectations are the key in successful relationships. Many people harbor some very unrealistic expectations, opening the door to marital problems. There are several things, and this would be something I would definitely ask you on a test at some point, that are key factors in good, committed relationships. So what are things that help make good, committed relationships? The first is that the partners establish love maps. If each person has their own goals and plans and they don't talk about this, their paths begin to separate, and as their relationship goes on, they get farther and farther apart. Love maps are what are created in successful relationships. Both partners are willing to share their feelings and their life goals. And so this sharing leads to these detailed love maps of each other's inner emotional life and the creation of a shared meaning in the relationship. If you love someone, you want what's best for them. Second factor is shared power and providing mutual support. The common portrayal of husbands is that they're the head of household and wives secretly wield true power. That creates unrealistic expectations. They have to share the power and respect each other's point of view. Next is to practice conflict management. When you live with someone, there's going to be conflicts. Successful couples work hard to solve their solvable conflicts. They negotiate, they accommodate. Sometimes it gets to the point where things are pretty bad, but if they want to be successful, they may be willing to go to marriage counseling to learn how to resolve these conflicts. They don't just quit. And they learn to accept their unsolvable conflicts. Should the toilet paper roll over the top, or should it roll from under the bottom? And we have this big argument. Well, is toilet paper really worth more than your marriage? So people need to learn to compromise. And of course, it has to be shared. If just one person is doing all the compromising, then they're just being a rug that's being stepped on. So they have to know the difference between what are solvable issues and unsolvable issues. And it's not about being right. You might be right, but you don't have to prove it. You don't have to make the argument. What is it that will settle the conflict that you're having? Another key area, we talked about this before, is similarity. Successful relationships share similar values and beliefs and interests. Okay, where you have opposites attract, that's might be personality characteristics where you kind of fill in the holes with each other, but the best predictor of a long-lasting relationship is similarity in values, beliefs, religion, and so on. And then in a successful relationship, they create a supportive social environment. Okay, we have people and friends and family to support that relationship. That's why we have big weddings to put in public and say, we're making this contract, this commitment, and we want you, our friends and family, to help us, okay, share in that contract and to help us with our issues. Instead of running off somewhere and just having a quick wedding with nobody there to witness that you're making a commitment to your partner. There are certain factors that can overpower and erode love. That includes age. Younger people who marry younger tend to have higher divorce rates. Money is one thing that's a big argument in relationships. Employment, divorce is much higher among the poor and unemployed. Parental marriages, the models, divorce is higher for children of divorced parents. The length of courtship, longer is better. The longer you know someone before you marry them, the more you truly get to know them and how they respond to challenges and conflicts. Premarital pregnancy. Those who tend to have premarital pregnancy tend to have higher divorce rates. And lastly, another key factor is to maintain a positive emphasis on your partner's negative behavior. So we're not just saying be positive, be happy. We're saying when you look at your partner's behavior, and there's things that might be annoying, marriage is not the place where you indulge your bad moods and openly criticize one another. You keep these positive emotions, these positive moods, these positive behaviors towards your partner. Those are vitally important to a lasting, happy relationship. Somebody says, well, I should see if what they're like before I marry them. What if they grossly brush their teeth? Well, don't watch them brush their teeth. Okay? If you look at your partner's flaws, then you're going to think about those, and that's going to erode the relationships. A positive emphasis is knowing that nobody's perfect and being willing to overlook some of these things. Work is something that people have to develop through in life. They have their career desires that are going to shape their future. Many people want a career that's going to make them well off financially, but work defines us in very fundamental ways. Our career can affect our health. It affects what friendships we have. It affects where we live. It affects our leisure activities. If you want to be a teacher, you have the summer off. That is very different than somebody who works all year and maybe has 2 weeks off for vacation. What kind of people do you hang out with at work? So the kind of work we choose defines us in very fundamental ways. And there's a personality job fit theory that says our personality matches up to certain careers very well, and that could determine our success and our satisfaction. And so I'm sure you're aware of questionnaires that then match you up with likely careers. At some point, people have to think about retirement and aging. There's the activity theory of aging, okay, where successful aging is fostered by good health, control over one's life and social support, by participation in community services and social activity. And then there's a socio-emotional selectivity theory. When you're young, you're exposed to lots of people. You have different classes, different schools. You are constantly meeting new people. You're trying different things. But older adults become more selective with their time, and they consequently see a decline in social contact. They tend to choose familiar people who provide those emotionally meaningful interactions. They're more selective about the things that they like to do. They know what they like to do. That's what they choose. In societies that value older people as wise elders or keepers of valued traditions, the stress of aging is much less than in societies that view older adults as mentally slow or socially useless. So we look at a chart that looks at the socio-emotional needs. There's a theory that says in adolescence we have very high knowledge needs. We're seeking to learn things and try new things. And as we get older, those knowledge needs decrease, but our emotional needs increase. So in retirement, what kind of things should we look at in retirement? Lastly, we have to deal with death and dying, our own and others. Children and adults interpret and respond to death differently. Children learn about death through the things that happen. If a child has a dog and the dog dies and the parents go out that day and buy a new dog just like the old one, the child is not learning the permanency of death. So Fido's gone, now Fido in some form is back. So there's three basic concepts. The first is permanence. Once a living thing dies, it cannot be brought back to life. If a child gets that new dog right away, they're not learning that permanence concept. Next is universality. All living things eventually die. And lastly is non-function. All living functions end at death. A researcher named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross spent hundreds of hours at the bedsides of the terminally ill. What she discovered is that people go through certain stages when they learn that they're going to die. Not everyone goes through the stages in the same way. Okay, and not necessarily in the same order, but there are very typical stages that people go through. The first is denial. It can't be true. You get the results from the doctor, says you have cancer, you have 6 months to live, and you don't believe it. You can't imagine that that could be true. And so there's that denial. Next is a stage of anger. Why me? It's not fair. I've done this all my life. Or the doctor screwed up. I could have got better care somewhere. And so there's a stage of anger. Then the person begins to move to bargaining. Sometimes they're religious and they say, oh God, please, I'll go to church every Sunday, or I'll be nicer to people, or I'll stop swearing if you just let me live. Sometimes they try to bargain with the healthcare providers. Oh, please, I'll build a new wing to the hospital. Just find a way to cure this. The next stage is depression. When a person realizes that they're going to die and that they've lost everything that they have, and that can send a person into a depression when they think about that. Lastly is a stage of acceptance, where they know that they're going to die, they're not going through this denial stage anymore, and they realize that they've got to make the best of things while they can. Now, these stages can be seen not only on the things that a terminal ill person faces, but how we react to the death of a loved one. We have some very similar stages. The first stage, again, is denial, not believing that that person has died. Okay, they think, well, they're not really dead. They're going to come walking through the door here any minute. Okay, or they get a call from the hospital. Well, the hospital made a mistake. They got the wrong person. There's that initial stage of denial, not believing that that person has actually died. Next is anger, to blame someone. Okay, the doctor could have done this, or this other person should have done this, and they're trying to find fault on why this happened. The next stage is guilt. Oh, if I would have not let them leave the house that day, or if I would have spent a little more time with them, or maybe I should have kissed them goodbye. There's the guilt that their death is somehow your fault, but there's also guilt that, not that the death is your fault, but that you feel guilty that you didn't tell them you love them, or you feel guilty that you didn't take better care of them in these last days. The next stage is depression, realizing, and it's a very difficult concept for people to understand who've never lost a loved one. There's that sense of disbelief, but then there's that very deep depression and grief, realizing that you'll never see them again. And people have to be allowed to work through that depression and mourn that loss. You can't tell people, well, you need to get over it and move on. They need to experience the grief and the mourning and the loss. And lastly is acceptance. At some point, we accept that they've died. That doesn't mean we get over it, because we carry that hurt forever. Okay? But it means we know that they're not going to come walking through the door. And now, how are we going to get on with our life? Okay, accepting that they've died. And some people get on with their lives and feel, I'm going to make them proud and they're a part of me. I'm going to use that part of me in my life. And others have very difficult time in acceptance and often have very great problems processing through that. So this, and the study of death is called thanatology. This study has really led to greater hospice care to help those people who are dying to die with dignity, and to have people who are trained staff to provide that loving support to them, for the terminally ill person, and to their families. And so now, instead of often when we know someone's dying and having them live out their days in a cold hospital environment, they get hospice care and bring a hospital bed home and have nurses and social workers check up on the family so the person can be around their loved ones. So different ages interpret and respond to death according to what three principles? Permanence, universality, and non-functionality. And then if I was giving you a test, I might give you a test on how a person would respond in each of the 5 stages of Kubler-Ross's death and dying. So in this chapter, you've gotten some insights on parenting. You're going to have to decide someday what kind of parent you're going to be. You've had some insight onto successful relationships and how could you use that in your own life. And so this concludes Chapter 10 on lifespan development.